October 31, 1945 marked the first time Hiroko Yamamoto saw children dressed as ghosts in broad daylight, their laughter echoing through streets that should have been solemn. She pressed her face against the cold window of the military transport bus, her breath fogging the glass as costumed figures darted between houses in suburban San Francisco. The 23-year-old former Imperial Japanese Army nurse couldn't reconcile what she was seeing with everything she knew about American occupation forces. The war had ended 2 months earlier, on September 2, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Hiroko and 47 other female Japanese prisoners of war had been transported from a temporary holding facility in Manila to the United States, ostensibly for processing before eventual repatriation. According to a New York Times article from October 1945, this particular group represented some of the first Japanese POWs to arrive on American soil, creating both logistical challenges and intense public curiosity for military authorities. The women had expected many things upon arrival in the land they had been taught to fear and fight. They anticipated interrogation, possibly harsh treatment, certainly the grim efficiency of a victorious military machine. Instead, they found themselves housed in a converted warehouse near the Oakland Naval Supply Depot, provided with clean bedding, adequate food, and guards who seemed more confused about their presence than hostile toward it. But nothing in their orientation, no briefing from American officers, no broken English explanation from translators, had prepared them for this spectacle unfolding outside their transport vehicle. Children wearing white sheets with eye holes cut out ran screaming with joy between houses. Teenagers in elaborate costumes knocked on doors, receiving handfuls of something from smiling adults. Orange lanterns with carved faces glowed from porches as dusk approached. Beside Hiroko, Keiko Tanaka whispered urgently in Japanese, "Are they celebrating our capture? Is this a victory festival?" The 31-year-old former field communications officer had been captured on Luzon in March 1945, and her 7 months in captivity had taught her to expect the unexpected from Americans. Yet this display seemed to transcend military celebration into something else entirely, something almost supernatural. Lieutenant Margaret Henderson, their escort officer, noticed the women's disturbed expressions and confusion. The 28-year-old WAC officer had volunteered for this unusual assignment, specifically because of her minor in anthropology at Smith College. She understood the importance of cultural translation in this unprecedented situation, though even she hadn't anticipated Halloween falling during the transport schedule. "It's just Halloween," she said in her limited Japanese, gestures supplementing vocabulary. "Children's holiday, not dangerous, for fun." The explanation meant nothing. The Japanese women exchanged glances that mixed bewilderment with genuine fear. Several clutched small Buddhist amulets they'd been permitted to keep, their knuckles white. In their understanding, spirits and the dead belonged to specific festivals like Obon, contained within ritual and respect. This chaotic celebration of death imagery, this mockery of ghosts and skeletons, seemed like cultural madness, or perhaps evidence of spiritual corruption they'd been warned defined American society. Michiko Sato, at 35, the oldest among them and a former surgical nurse from Kyoto, finally voiced what many were thinking. "They celebrate death so casually. What kind of people have we surrendered to?" November 1, 1945, arrived with morning light filtering through the high warehouse windows, revealing the exhausted faces of women who had barely slept. The previous night's Halloween spectacle had created an atmosphere of unease that no amount of rational explanation from Lieutenant Henderson could fully dispel. The converted warehouse that served as their temporary quarters contained 50 cots arranged in neat rows, each with a gray wool blanket and a pillow that still smelled faintly of military soap. Hiroko sat on her cot, legs crossed beneath her, watching as breakfast was delivered by a team of soldiers who seemed barely older than teenagers. They wheeled in metal carts containing oatmeal, toast, coffee, and something the women had never encountered before: small packets of instant orange juice powder. The young soldiers smiled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the novelty of serving female enemy combatants. One freckled private from Nebraska couldn't have been more than 19 years old. and he fumbled with the serving ladles while carefully avoiding eye contact. The reality of their situation had begun settling into the women's consciousness with the weight of concrete. They were not in a traditional POW camp, nor were they free. This liminal space between captivity and release felt more disorienting than outright imprisonment would have been. According to military protocols established under the Geneva Conventions, female POWs were to be housed separately from male prisoners and provided certain accommodations, though the actual implementation of these rules varied widely depending on location and commanding officers. Keiko Tanaka had spent the early morning hours attempting to document their experience in a small notebook she'd been given by one of the Red Cross representatives who had briefly visited 3 days earlier. Her careful Japanese characters filled the pages, recording not just events but emotions, observations, and questions that multiplied faster than answers appeared. She wrote about the Halloween phenomenon, describing it as a festival where Americans wear the faces of death and demons while children laugh and eat sweets, as though the boundaries between this world and the next mean nothing to them. The cultural shock extended beyond Halloween itself. Throughout their first week in American custody, the women had encountered a cascade of bewildering experiences. The abundance of food, even for prisoners, seemed incomprehensible, given what they knew about wartime rationing. The casual interaction between male and female soldiers violated every understanding they had of proper military hierarchy and gender separation. Most disturbing was the apparent kindness, which felt either like elaborate psychological manipulation or evidence that everything they'd been taught about American brutality was false. Lieutenant Henderson had arranged for a Japanese-American translator to meet with the women that morning. Daniel Nakamura, a Nisei sergeant from the Military Intelligence Service, arrived shortly after breakfast. The 32-year-old had spent the war years first in an internment camp with his family, then proving his loyalty through military service as a translator in the Pacific Theater. His presence created its own complicated dynamics. To the Japanese women, he represented both connection and betrayal, someone who spoke their language but wore the enemy's uniform. This context regarding Japanese-American translators and their complex roles was documented extensively in the Pacific Historical Review, which published detailed accounts of the Military Intelligence Service's contributions to the war effort and subsequent occupation operations. Sergeant Nakamura sat on a folding chair facing the assembled women, his posture military straight but his expression attempting warmth. "I understand yesterday evening was confusing for you," he began in fluent Japanese, his Californian accent barely detectable. "Lieutenant Henderson asked me to explain American customs that might seem strange during your stay here." Michiko Sato spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "Why do Americans celebrate death and spirits without ritual respect? In Japan, we honor our ancestors during Obon with reverence and ceremony. What you showed us yesterday looked like mockery of the dead." Nakamura nodded slowly, recognizing the deep cultural chasm he needed to bridge. Halloween is not about real spirits or ancestors. It's a children's holiday borrowed from European traditions, specifically Irish and Celtic customs. Americans don't actually believe in the ghosts and monsters children dress as. It's play, imagination, entertainment. The explanation hung in the air, not quite landing. The distinction between believing in spirits and celebrating their imagery seemed meaningless to women raised in a culture where even play involving supernatural elements carried ritual significance. November 5, 1945 brought unexpected visitors to the warehouse facility. A delegation from the International Red Cross arrived for their scheduled inspection, accompanied by 2 female journalists who had somehow obtained permission to observe and interview the Japanese POWs. The journalists represented different publications: Susan McCarthy from the San Francisco Chronicle and Ellen Tanaka, a Japanese-American reporter for the Pacific Citizen, a newspaper serving the Nisei community. Hiroko watched the preparation for this visit with mixed feelings. Lieutenant Henderson had spent the previous evening coaching them on what to expect, explaining that the Red Cross inspections were designed to ensure proper treatment under international law. The concept itself was foreign. Why would the victorious nation allow outside observers to check on enemy prisoners? In the Imperial Japanese Army structure, such transparency would have been considered weakness, a dangerous exposure of internal operations to foreign scrutiny. The warehouse had been cleaned thoroughly, though it had hardly been dirty to begin with. The women had been provided fresh clothing 2 days earlier, simple gray dresses that resembled civilian wear more than prison uniforms. This, too, had sparked discussion among them. Keiko had theorized that perhaps the Americans wanted to present a civilized image to international observers, while others suggested it might be genuine concern for their welfare. The truth likely contained elements of both motivations. Susan McCarthy entered the facility with notebook in hand, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The 34-year-old journalist had built her career covering human interest stories during the war years, and this assignment represented something unprecedented. Female Japanese POWs on American soil were not just a novelty. They were a window into questions about gender, warfare, and the reconstruction of enemy populations that would define the post-war period. Ellen Tanaka's presence created immediate interest among the Japanese women. Here was someone who looked like them, but clearly belonged to the American world. The 29-year-old journalist had spent 1942 through 1945 in the Gila River internment camp in Arizona with her family, using whatever writing opportunities she could find to document her community's experience. Her subsequent work with the Pacific Citizen focused on telling stories of Japanese Americans attempting to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of internment. Through Sergeant Nakamura's translation, Susan McCarthy began asking questions that revealed her genuine curiosity, rather than mere journalistic opportunism. "What surprised you most about America so far?" she asked, directing her attention to no one specifically, allowing whoever felt comfortable to respond. Michiko Sato considered the question carefully before answering. The abundance of everything, food, clothing, kindness even. We were told America was a dying empire, exhausted by war. Instead, we see wealth and energy everywhere. Either we were lied to completely or America hid its suffering very well. The journalist scribbled notes quickly. "And the Halloween celebration you witnessed on your first night here? I understand that caused some confusion." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the assembled women. Hiroko found herself speaking up, surprising herself with her willingness to engage. It wasn't just confusion, it was frightening. In our culture, death and spirits are sacred matters. To see children playing with death imagery so casually, to see adults encouraging it, made us wonder what kind of people we had truly been fighting against. Ellen Tanaka interjected gently in Japanese, then English for McCarthy's benefit. "In Japan, would you say there's a stronger boundary between the sacred and the everyday, between what should be treated seriously and what can be played with?" The question demonstrated a depth of understanding that made several women lean forward with increased interest. Keiko Tanaka responded thoughtfully, "Yes, exactly. In Japan, even children's games have rules rooted in respect for tradition and spiritual boundaries. The freedom American children seem to have to make entertainment from anything including death itself suggests either great spiritual confidence or dangerous disrespect." These observations would later appear in Susan McCarthy's November 10, 1945 article in the San Francisco Chronicle titled, "Enemy Nurses Speak. Japanese POWs Reflect on American Culture Shock," which provided one of the earliest first-hand accounts of Japanese perspectives on American society during the immediate post-war period. The Red Cross inspection proceeded simultaneously with the interviews. 2 Swiss delegates moved through the facility with clipboards, measuring the space between cots, checking the quality of food in the kitchen area, examining the bathroom facilities, and documenting everything with meticulous precision. November 12, 1945 marked a turning point in the women's captivity when Lieutenant Henderson announced they would be permitted limited supervised outings into nearby areas. The decision came from higher command levels, reflecting a calculated risk that exposing the Japanese POWs to American civilian life might serve strategic purposes for future occupation policies in Japan. If these women could be convinced of American benevolence and prosperity, they might become informal ambassadors upon repatriation. The first outing was planned for a local market in Oakland, a controlled environment where interaction could be monitored and potential hostility minimized. Hiroko felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as they prepared. She had worn military uniforms or prisoner clothing for so long that the simple civilian dress provided by the army felt like a costume. 10 women would go on this initial trip, selected by Lieutenant Henderson based on their relative emotional stability and English language capability, however minimal. The group assembled outside the warehouse at 8 o'clock in the morning, the November air crisp and filled with the scent of salt water from the nearby bay. 2 military police jeeps would escort them, along with Sergeant Nakamura and Lieutenant Henderson. The precautions seemed excessive given the women's physical exhaustion and lack of anywhere to escape to, but protocol demanded security measures that acknowledged their nominal status as enemy combatants. The market itself occupied a large building that had once served as a cannery. Inside, the abundance made Hiroko's breath catch in her throat. Rows of fresh vegetables, fruits she couldn't identify, cuts of meat wrapped in clean paper, shelves stocked with canned goods and packaged foods bearing colorful labels. All of this existed less than 3 months after the war's end. The contrast with Japan's wartime deprivation, which she knew had only worsened after surrender, was so stark it felt deliberately staged. Keiko Tanaka whispered urgently, "This cannot be real. They must have arranged this as propaganda to show us false prosperity." Several other women nodded agreement, the explanation providing comfort. The alternative, that this represented normal American civilian life, was too disturbing to accept immediately. A middle-aged woman selecting apples noticed the group's foreign appearance and distinctive escort. Her expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and then something harder to read. She approached slowly, and Lieutenant Henderson tensed, ready to intervene. But the woman simply said, "You're from Japan, aren't you? The ones they brought back." Sergeant Nakamura translated quickly. Michiko Sato nodded carefully, unsure what response was appropriate. The American woman continued, her voice soft. "My son died at Okinawa. He was 22 years old." The air seemed to freeze around them. Hiroko felt her face flush with shame and fear, waiting for the accusation or attack that would naturally follow. Instead, the woman said, "I'm glad you survived. I'm glad someone survived. This war took enough from everyone." She returned to selecting her apples, leaving the Japanese women stunned and confused in her wake. The encounter was witnessed by Ellen Tanaka, who had arranged to coincidentally be present during the outing for a follow-up story. She later documented this interaction in the Pacific Citizen, noting how it represented both the complexity of American reactions to former enemies and the beginning of a difficult reconciliation process that would characterize the occupation period. The shopping trip continued with several similar encounters. Some Americans stared with undisguised curiosity or suspicion, but no one was openly hostile. A young mother even smiled at them while holding her infant. An elderly man nodded respectfully. The ordinariness of it all felt extraordinary to women who had been prepared for hatred and retaliation. Back at the warehouse that evening, the outing became the subject of intense discussion. The women sat in small groups on and around their cots, voices animated in ways they hadn't been since arrival. Hiroko found herself in a circle with Keiko, Michiko, and 3 others, debating what they had witnessed. "It's sophisticated propaganda," Keiko insisted. "They carefully selected sympathetic Americans and staged the entire experience to manipulate our perceptions. The woman who lost her son was probably an actress." But Michiko shook her head slowly. "I've treated enough grieving mothers to recognize real loss. That woman's pain was genuine, and her forgiveness, or whatever it was, confused her as much as it confused us. I don't think it was staged." November 20th, 1945, brought an announcement that created both hope and anxiety among the Japanese women prisoners. They would be permitted to write letters home to their families in Japan, subject to censorship and with no guarantee of delivery given the chaotic state of Japanese postal systems in the occupation's early months. Lieutenant Henderson distributed writing materials, plain paper, pencils, and thin envelopes marked with official military postal stamps. Hiroko sat at a makeshift desk created from 2 crates and a plank of wood, staring at the blank paper for nearly an hour before writing her first character. What could she possibly tell her family in Yokohama? That she had survived when so many others hadn't? That America was nothing like what they had been told? That she had seen children celebrate death as entertainment and felt her understanding of the world fundamentally challenged? She finally began writing, her characters careful and formal. Honorable Father and Mother, I am alive and well in America. The treatment here is adequate and follows international standards. I hope this letter finds you healthy and that our home survived the final months of the war. Please know that I think of you constantly and pray for our reunion. The letter felt hollow, a shell of truth wrapped around an absence of real communication. How could she explain in censored correspondence that her entire worldview was being systematically deconstructed? That every day brought new evidence that the narrative she had believed about America and the war was incomplete at best, deliberately false at worst? Keiko Tanaka approached letter writing with characteristic methodical precision. She wrote to her younger sister in Hiroshima, unaware whether her sister had survived the atomic bombing on August 6, 1945. The uncertainty made every sentence feel like sending words into a void. Dearest Yuki, if you receive this letter, please respond immediately so I know you are alive. I am currently held in California but expect repatriation within the coming months. America is very different from what we were taught. The people here seem to have plenty of food and resources. I miss you terribly and pray you survived the final days of the war. The reference to the atomic bombing was implicit, too dangerous to state directly in correspondence that would be read by American censors. The entire subject of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hung over the Japanese women's captivity, like a dark storm that everyone acknowledged but no one directly discussed. Michiko Sato wrote to her husband, a surgeon who had been stationed in Manchuria when she last heard from him in early 1945. She had no way of knowing if he had survived the Soviet invasion in August, or what had become of Japanese forces there. Her letter mixed practical information with emotion she usually kept carefully controlled. My dear Takeshi, I am alive and held as a prisoner in America, though treated well by the standards of such situations. I witnessed something called Halloween that troubled me greatly, but I am learning that American customs are simply different, not necessarily evil as we were taught. Please find me when I return home. I cannot imagine rebuilding life without you. According to documentation from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, these letters represented some of the earliest direct communication between Japanese POWs held in America and their families in occupied Japan. The military postal system had been re-established in September 1945, but remained unreliable for months afterward. Many letters written during this period never reached their destinations, lost in the chaos of a shattered empire attempting to reconstitute itself under foreign occupation. Lieutenant Henderson collected the letters personally, treating them with visible respect. She understood these pieces of paper represented more than just communication. They were lifelines of hope for women living in profound uncertainty. Before sealing each envelope, she read the contents as required, marking certain passages for potential redaction by higher-level censors. Her Japanese reading ability was limited, requiring Sergeant Nakamura's assistance for complete translation. Some letters contained passages that would definitely be censored. One woman had written critically about American military installations she had observed, technical details that could be considered intelligence even after the war's end. Another had described the abundance of resources in terms that might be considered undermining American wartime sacrifice narratives. Most, however, were simply human expressions of longing, confusion, and hope that transcended political considerations. That evening, after the letters had been collected, the women gathered in their largest spontaneous assembly since arrival. Someone began singing quietly, an old folk song from northern Japan about a traveler far from home. Other voices joined, creating harmony that filled the warehouse's vast space with heartache and beauty. Even the guards posted at the doors seemed moved, though they couldn't understand the words. Hiroko sang with tears streaming down her face, releasing emotions she had kept locked away since her capture. The music created a temporary refuge, a space where they could be simply Japanese women longing for home, rather than prisoners navigating an incomprehensible foreign world. November 22, 1945 arrived with unusual preparation and excitement among the American military personnel staffing the facility. Lieutenant Henderson announced that the Japanese women would participate in the American Thanksgiving celebration, an idea that created immediate confusion and concern among the prisoners. Another holiday involving strange customs and inexplicable rituals Coming so soon after the Halloween shock, Sergeant Nakamura spent the previous evening attempting to explain the concept. Thanksgiving is a harvest festival where Americans gather with family to eat a large meal together and express gratitude for good things in their lives. It's one of the most important American holidays, more significant than Halloween. His explanation did little to clarify why prisoners of war would be included in such a family-oriented celebration. The warehouse had been decorated with paper turkeys, autumn leaves, and hand-drawn pilgrim figures that meant nothing to women unfamiliar with American colonial history. The decorations seemed childish to Hiroko, reminiscent of elementary school festivals in Japan, yet the Americans took them seriously, smiling as they hung each paper ornament. The meal preparation had been underway since dawn. In addition to the usual military cooks, several volunteers from local churches had obtained permission to assist, bringing their own dishes to contribute to what they insisted on calling a proper Thanksgiving feast. This civilian involvement represented another calculated decision by military authorities to expose the Japanese women to ordinary Americans in controlled settings. By noon, the warehouse had been transformed. Long tables had been set up in rows covered with white paper tablecloths. The usual metal military trays had been replaced with actual plates and silverware. Steam rose from dishes arranged cafeteria style: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls, and pumpkin pie. The quantities seemed obscene to women who had spent years under wartime rationing followed by months of military custody. Among the civilian volunteers was Dorothy Peterson, a 62-year-old Methodist minister's wife, who had insisted on participating despite her church congregation's mixed feelings about showing hospitality to former enemies. She moved among the tables with a coffee pot, refilling cups and attempting conversation despite the language barrier. Her weathered face showed kindness that seemed unshakable, even toward women whose countrymen had killed American boys. Michiko Sato found herself seated across from Dorothy during the meal. Through Sergeant Nakamura's translation, they engaged in halting conversation. "Why are you here?" Michiko asked bluntly. "Why show kindness to enemies?" Dorothy considered the question while cutting her turkey. "Because you're not enemies anymore. The war is over. And because my faith teaches me that all people are children of God, even when we've been fighting each other, especially then." The theological certainty in her voice struck Michiko as both admirable and naive. Many Japanese died fighting Americans. Many Americans died fighting us. Does your God forgive that easily? Forgiveness isn't easy, Dorothy replied slowly. But it's necessary. Otherwise, the war never really ends, does it? It just continues in our hearts forever. The conversation was documented by Ellen Tanaka, who had again managed to secure access to observe the Thanksgiving celebration. Her article in the December 1st, 1945 edition of the Pacific Citizen explored the theological and philosophical dimensions of reconciliation through the lens of this holiday meal, noting how American religious frameworks influenced approaches to former enemies in ways distinctly different from Japanese cultural patterns. The meal itself became a source of cultural education in multiple directions. The Japanese women had never encountered turkey, and many found its texture strange compared to fish and chicken that dominated Japanese cuisine. The concept of cranberry sauce as a condiment for meat seemed bizarre. Pumpkin pie was received with polite confusion. A vegetable transformed into sweet dessert violated their categories of proper food relationships. Conversely, Lieutenant Henderson and the American volunteers watched with fascination as the Japanese women instinctively arranged their food in aesthetically pleasing patterns on their plates before eating, a habit ingrained from Japanese food presentation traditions. Several women quietly said what appeared to be a brief prayer before eating, their hands pressed together in a gesture unfamiliar to the Christian volunteers who had expected more recognizable religious expressions. Halfway through the meal, Lieutenant Henderson stood and attempted to explain the tradition of sharing what one was thankful for. Through Sergeant Nakamura's translation, she encouraged everyone present to participate. The request created awkward silence. What were prisoners of war supposed to say they were thankful for? Finally, Keiko Tanaka stood slowly. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "I am thankful to be alive. I am thankful that the war is over. and I am confused to be thankful for the kindness of people I expected to hate me." She sat down quickly, her face flushed with emotion. Her words opened a floodgate. Other Japanese women began standing, expressing gratitude for survival, for the end of fighting, for the hope of seeing families again. One young nurse named Hanako Yoshida thanked the American medical staff who had treated her injuries after capture. December 3, 1945 brought an official photographer to the facility, a development that created immediate tension among the Japanese women. They had been photographed before, mugshots upon arrival, identification photos for Red Cross records, but this was different. Captain Robert Morrison from the Army Signal Corps had been sent to document the female POW program for what he described as historical and administrative purposes. Hiroko watched the photographer set up his equipment with growing unease. In Japanese culture, having one's photograph taken carried significance, a capturing of one's image that felt intimate and potentially dangerous. The women had been taught that Americans might use propaganda photographs to humiliate defeated enemies, to display them as trophies of victory. Yet Captain Morrison seemed more focused on technical lighting concerns than exploitation. Lieutenant Henderson gathered the women to explain the session's purpose. "These photographs will be part of the official military record. They'll document your presence here and your treatment under international law. Some may eventually be shared with press outlets, but only with your consent for specific uses." The emphasis on consent struck the women as strange. Since when did prisoners have choice in such matters? The first photographs were formal group portraits. The women were arranged in rows, their expressions controlled and unsmiling. Captain Morrison worked efficiently, adjusting his camera and calling out positions. "Relax your shoulders. Look directly at the camera. Good." His professional demeanor helped reduce the sense of exploitation, though tension remained palpable. Then something unexpected happened. After completing the required formal documentation, Captain Morrison asked through Sergeant Nakamura if any women would be willing to be photographed, engaged in daily activities, reading, writing letters, playing cards, conversing. "I want to show that you're real people, not just uniformed prisoners," he explained. "The American public needs to see the human dimension of what war means." The request created debate among the women. Keiko Tanaka was suspicious. "They'll use these images to make themselves look merciful while hiding the truth of occupation in Japan." But Michiko Sato saw potential value. "Or perhaps showing our humanity helps their people understand that their enemies were human too. That might make future wars less likely." 7 women volunteered, including Hiroko. Captain Morrison photographed her sitting on her cot, writing in a notebook Lieutenant Henderson had provided. The image captured her in profile, afternoon light streaming through the high warehouse windows, her expression concentrated and thoughtful. The photograph would later appear in the January 1946 issue of Life magazine in an article titled, "Enemy Prisoners Face Peace," one of several images that began shifting American public perception of Japanese people from monolithic enemy to individualized human beings. Another powerful photograph captured Michiko Sato teaching basic English to 3 younger women. They sat in a circle on the warehouse floor, a makeshift chalkboard propped against a crate, their faces intent with concentration. The image suggested adaptation, learning, and the human capacity for growth even in captivity. The most striking photograph, however, was unplanned. During a break in the session, Captain Morrison noticed several women gathered around a window, watching rain fall outside. Their silhouettes against the gray light, their postures mixing longing and resignation, created an image of profound pathos. He captured it quickly, instinctively. That photograph would later be used by the Red Cross in materials about POW repatriation, its emotional power transcending language and politics. Ellen Tanaka, who had become a regular presence during significant events at the facility, observed the photo session with particular interest. She understood the power of images in shaping narratives and knew these photographs would influence how both Americans and Japanese understood this strange moment in history. In her December 8, 1945 article for the Pacific Citizen, she wrote, "The camera captures what words struggle to express. that enemies are created by politics and geography, but humanity persists beneath uniforms and national identities. After the formal session ended, Captain Morrison did something unusual. He offered to take personal photographs of any women who wanted them, images they could keep or send to families. The offer was generous and violated no regulations, but it surprised everyone. Several women accepted, posing in small groups or individually, attempting to smile for families who might never receive these images. Hiroko requested a solo photograph. She wanted her parents to see that she had survived, that she was being treated adequately. Captain Morrison positioned her near a window for natural light, asking her to think of something that made her happy. She thought of her childhood home in Yokohama, the cherry trees that bloomed each spring, her mother's voice singing traditional songs. Something in her expression softened, and Morrison clicked the shutter. December 10, 1945 shattered the relative calm when Sergeant Nakamura arrived with newspapers from Japan. The first substantial information the women had received about their homeland since capture. The papers were weeks old, having traveled the slow route through military postal channels, but they contained revelations that left the women reeling with shock and grief. The headlines spoke of devastation beyond what anyone had imagined. Cities reduced to ash, millions homeless, food shortages reaching crisis levels, the emperor's divinity officially renounced, and the occupation force of Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur implementing radical changes to Japanese government and society. But most devastating were the photographs and detailed reports about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the full scope of atomic destruction finally visible in images that seemed apocalyptic. Hiroko sat with the newspaper spread before her, hands trembling as she read accounts of the new weapon that had killed tens of thousands instantly and continued killing through mysterious radiation sickness. The scale of destruction made conventional warfare seem almost quaint by comparison. She thought of Keiko's sister in Hiroshima and understood with sinking certainty that the silence from that city meant what everyone feared. Keiko herself had withdrawn to her cot, face turned toward the wall, shoulders shaking with silent grief. The confirmation that Hiroshima had been essentially erased made her previous hope seem foolish in retrospect. Her sister Yuki had been a schoolteacher there, living near the city center. The chances of survival were minimal. Other women gathered around her, offering comfort through presence rather than words, understanding that some losses were too large for language. The revelation created a crisis of understanding for all the women. They had known Japan lost the war, had surrendered unconditionally, but the full magnitude of defeat and destruction had been abstract until now. These newspapers made it visceral and undeniable. The empire they had served, the nation they had believed was fighting a righteous defensive war, had been comprehensively destroyed, its cities burned, its people starving, its entire political and social structure being forcibly reorganized by foreign occupiers. Michiko Sato found Lieutenant Henderson in the small office space that served as facility command. The American officer looked up from paperwork, immediately recognizing distress in Michiko's expression. "You've seen the newspapers?" she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Why didn't you tell us?" Michiko's voice was controlled but intense. "Why let us discover the extent of devastation this way?" Lieutenant Henderson set down her pen slowly. "Because we didn't know how. There's no good way to tell people their entire world has been destroyed. And honestly, we weren't sure you'd believe us if we did. We thought seeing Japanese sources might be easier than hearing it from us." "Easier?" Michiko's laugh was bitter. "To discover that while we've been here eating turkey and learning about Halloween, our people have been starving? That cities were erased by weapons we didn't know existed? That everything we fought for ended in atomic fire? The conversation between them, documented in Lieutenant Henderson's official diary, which was later declassified and is now held in the National Archives, revealed the profound difficulty of managing information flow to prisoners whose entire national identity had been shattered. Henderson wrote, "How do you help someone grieve when you represent the force that caused their grief? How do you offer comfort when you're simultaneously the captor, and in their eyes, potentially the destroyer?" That evening, the warehouse atmosphere was heavy with mourning that had no clear outlet. The women couldn't properly observe Buddhist rituals for the dead without the necessary materials and ritual space. They couldn't return home to search for surviving family members. They could only sit with grief that felt as vast as the Pacific they had crossed. Sergeant Nakamura spent hours moving between small groups, translating when words seemed necessary, simply sitting in respectful silence when they didn't. His own complicated identity as Japanese by heritage but American by allegiance put him in a unique position to bridge the emotional chasm. He had family members who had been in Japan during the bombings, relatives he was trying to locate through military channels without success. Spontaneously, the women began creating a memorial space in one corner of the warehouse. They gathered small stones from outside, arranged them in careful patterns. Someone folded origami cranes from notebook paper. Another woman contributed a small Buddha figure she had somehow kept hidden through her entire captivity. The shrine grew organically throughout the evening, becoming a focus for grief that had nowhere else to go. December 20th, 1945 brought preparations for yet another American holiday the Japanese women didn't understand. Christmas decorations appeared throughout the facility, a small tree with handmade ornaments, strings of popcorn, paper snowflakes hanging from rafters. Lieutenant Henderson had clearly decided that continuing to expose the women to American cultural traditions was important, though the educational value remained debatable. Hiroko had begun to recognize a pattern in these holiday celebrations. Americans seemed to approach their cultural traditions with a combination of sincerity and playfulness that was foreign to Japanese sensibilities. Sacred and secular mixed freely in ways that still felt uncomfortable to her. Christmas appeared to be both a religious holiday, celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ, and an excuse for gift-giving, decorating, and feasting that had only tangential relationship to its spiritual origins. The Christian volunteers who had participated in Thanksgiving returned, this time with wrapped packages described as gifts for the women. The concept of gift-giving in this context created complex emotions. Japanese tradition involved elaborate gift protocols with clear reciprocity expectations. Receiving gifts from people you couldn't repay felt like accepting charity, which carried connotations of shame and obligation. Dorothy Peterson was among the volunteers again, her persistent kindness having worn down some of the women's defensive suspicion. She brought packages wrapped in colorful paper, explaining through Sergeant Nakamura that each contained practical items chosen specifically for women preparing to eventually return home. Sewing kits, writing materials, small English-Japanese dictionaries, and surprisingly, photographs taken by Captain Morrison during his visit. Hiroko opened her package to find the photograph of herself writing in her notebook, carefully printed and matted on cardboard. Seeing herself through American eyes was disorienting. She looked thoughtful, dignified even, not like a defeated enemy prisoner, but like any young woman engaged in quiet reflection. Alongside the photograph was a simple sewing kit and a small notebook with a note in careful Japanese characters. For continuing your observations. Your perspective matters. Keiko Tanaka received a similar package, but her photograph was different. Captain Morrison had captured her teaching English to younger women, and the image showed her in a moment of patient instruction, her grief over her sister temporarily set aside in service of helping others. The photograph seemed to show a future beyond grief, a possibility that she might survive this and rebuild a life despite loss. The gift-giving created an atmosphere of uncomfortable gratitude. Michiko Sato stood to address the volunteers, speaking through Sergeant Nakamura's translation. In Japanese culture, receiving gifts creates obligation to reciprocate. We have nothing to give you in return, which makes this difficult for us. But we want you to know that your kindness has challenged many of our assumptions about Americans. We were taught you were cruel people without culture or spiritual depth. Everything we've experienced here contradicts that teaching, and that's been one of the most difficult aspects of captivity. Discovering that we were wrong about you. Her words created visible emotion among the American volunteers. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Dorothy Peterson responded simply, "Understanding each other is gift enough. Maybe that's how we prevent future wars." The Christmas Eve celebration itself was primarily religious in nature. A chaplain from the Oakland Naval Supply Depot conducted a service in the warehouse, explaining the Christmas story through Sergeant Nakamura's translation. The narrative of a child born in difficult circumstances, refugees fleeing persecution, hope emerging from darkness. These themes resonated in unexpected ways, with women who felt displaced and uncertain about their futures. Several women asked questions about Christianity that revealed genuine curiosity. How could a religion celebrate its founder's birth with such joy while also venerating his death? Why was Jesus depicted as a baby in Christmas imagery, when his teachings came from adulthood? The questions reflected deep cultural differences in how religious figures were understood and commemorated. According to military chaplain records from December 1945, documented in the American Religious History Archives, several Japanese POWs expressed interest in learning more about Christianity during this period. This wasn't necessarily conversion interest, but rather intellectual curiosity about the religious framework that seemed to underpin American culture. The chaplain noted in his report, "Their questions reveal sophisticated theological thinking and genuine attempts to understand American motivations through religious context." That night, after the volunteers had departed and the facility had settled into quiet, Hiroko found herself unable to sleep. She walked to the window where Captain Morrison had photographed women watching the rain, looking out at the American night. Christmas lights glowed from distant houses, creating patterns of warmth against the darkness. She realized something had shifted in her understanding over these months. Halloween, Thanksgiving, and now Christmas had initially seemed like incomprehensible foreign customs, but she was beginning to recognize them as expressions of deeper values. The ability to play with darkness rather than being consumed by it, gratitude even in difficult times, hope embodied in celebration. These weren't evidence of American superficiality, but rather different ways of approaching universal human needs for meaning, connection, and joy. January 1st, 1946 arrived with snow, rare for Oakland but perfect for the symbolic bridge the women recognized between American and Japanese calendars. The Japanese New Year celebration traditionally occurred on this date since the Meiji era's calendar reform, making this one of the few holidays that aligned between cultures, offering unexpected common ground. Lieutenant Henderson had researched Japanese New Year traditions with Sergeant Nakamura's help, attempting to create some observance that would feel familiar to the women. The effort was imperfect but genuine. Decorations in white and red paper, mochi rice cakes obtained from a Japanese-American family in San Francisco, and permission for the women to conduct traditional rituals as much as circumstances allowed. Hiroko woke before dawn, a habit from childhood when families rose early on New Year's Day to watch the first sunrise of the year, a practice called Hatsuhinode. She wasn't alone in this instinct. Nearly 20 women had gathered near the eastern-facing windows, watching in silence as gray light slowly illuminated the Bay Area landscape. Without speaking, they were sharing a moment of connection to tradition that transcended their current captivity. Michiko Sato led an informal observance, reciting from memory the traditional New Year's prayers. Her voice carried the weight of tradition, connecting them across distance to the Japan they had left behind. Other women joined in the familiar phrases, creating harmony that felt like home despite being thousands of miles from it. Even in this warehouse, even as prisoners of war, they could maintain continuity with cultural practices that defined who they were. The contrast with American New Year celebrations they had heard about was striking. Americans apparently stayed up late, drank alcohol, kissed at midnight, and treated the occasion as a party. The Japanese approach emphasized purification, new beginnings, family connection, and spiritual renewal. Yet both cultures marked the date as significant, recognizing time's passage and the human need to mark transitions with ritual and meaning. Later that morning, Dorothy Peterson arrived unexpectedly with a group of Japanese-American families from the local Buddhist church. They brought traditional New Year's foods, ozoni soup, soba noodles, and proper mochi rice cakes. The meeting between the imprisoned Japanese nationals and the Japanese Americans who had survived internment created a moment charged with complex emotions. Ellen Tanaka was among the visitors, having facilitated this connection through her church contacts. She observed the initial awkwardness as the two groups of Japanese-descended women faced each other across the divides of citizenship, loyalty, and war experience. The Japanese nationals had fought for the empire, The Japanese Americans had been imprisoned by their own government for their ethnicity, while their sons fought in American uniforms to prove loyalty. Keiko Tanaka spoke first, addressing the visitors formally. We heard about the internment camps. We were told this proved America treated Japanese people cruelly, that we were fighting to prevent such treatment of all Asian peoples. Now we understand the situation was more complicated than our military leaders told us. A Nisei woman named Grace Yamamoto responded quietly, her voice carrying both strength and sadness. Yes, it was complicated. America imprisoned us unjustly. But we also knew Japan's empire had committed terrible acts in Asia. There were no simple good and evil sides in this war, only degrees of wrong and occasional instances of right. The conversation that followed, documented by Ellen Tanaka in her January 5, 1946 article for the Pacific Citizen titled New Year's Bridge, Japanese POWs Meet Internment Survivors, explored themes of identity, loyalty, and survival that would define post-war Japanese-American and Japanese relationships for decades. The women discovered shared experiences of loss, displacement, and cultural identity struggle, despite their different positions in the war's complex tapestry. By afternoon, the groups had merged into a genuine New Year's celebration. Traditional games emerged, Karuta card games, where players competed to match poetry verses. Stories were exchanged about families back in Japan and families struggling to rebuild in America. The sharing of mochi became a ritual of connection rather than just eating. Lieutenant Henderson watched from the sidelines, understanding she was witnessing something beyond her initial intentions. These connections between former enemy nationals and American citizens of Japanese descent were creating a grassroots foundation for reconciliation that no government policy could manufacture. She made notes in her diary, recognizing the historical significance. Cultural identity transcends political boundaries when people are given space to recognize shared humanity. As evening approached, Hiroko found herself in conversation with Ellen Tanaka, the journalist who had documented so much of their experience. "What happens to us now?" Hiroko asked. "We've learned that Americans aren't the demons we were taught to hate. We've seen abundance where we expected cruelty, kindness where we expected revenge. How do we return to Japan carrying this knowledge?" Ellen considered the question seriously. "You become bridges yourselves. You return to a Japan that will be rebuilding not just buildings but understanding of the world. Your experiences here, however strange and difficult, give you perspectives that will be valuable. The war ended in atomic fire, but peace has to be built through thousands of individual choices to understand rather than hate, to learn rather than remain ignorant." The wisdom in her words carried weight beyond her years. Ellen herself was only 29 but had lived through internment, displacement, and the complex identity struggles of being American by birth but Japanese by heritage in a time when both identities carried pain. That night, the women gathered for a final traditional New Year's activity, writing wishes for the new year on small pieces of paper. In normal circumstances, these would be burned at a temple, carrying prayers to the heavens. Here, they would simply be kept as personal reminders of intentions and hopes. Hiroko wrote carefully, "May I carry understanding home. May I help rebuild not just Japan but also bridges between peoples. May I remember that humanity exists in all cultures, even former enemies." Keiko Tanaka wrote her wish with tears in her eyes. "May I find strength to live without my sister. May her death in atomic fire have some meaning if it prevents future such weapons from being used. May America and Japan never fight again." Michiko Sato, always the eldest and most pragmatic, wrote, "May we go home soon. May our medical knowledge help rebuild Japanese healthcare. May these young women find peace and purpose in a Japan that will be very different from the one we left." The facility lights dimmed that night on 50 Japanese women who had entered American captivity expecting the worst and had instead encountered something far more complicated. A nation with faults and virtues, capable of both atomic destruction and cultural generosity, populated by people who were neither demons nor angels, but simply humans navigating their own understanding of right and wrong. Their repatriation would come in March 1946, when transport ships finally became available for the return journey. They would arrive in Yokohama to a Japan transformed by defeat and occupation, carrying with them stories of Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas and kindness from unexpected sources. Their witness would become part of the complicated narrative of Japanese-American relations in the post-war period, a small thread in the larger tapestry of reconciliation that would eventually transform former enemies into allies. But on this New Year's night in January 1946, they simply gathered together in a warehouse in Oakland, California, singing traditional songs, eating mochi rice cakes, and holding on to hope that transcended the war's devastation, embodying the truth that even between enemies humanity could persist and create unexpected connections across the chasms of conflict.